Hello, my name is Patricia Kirby. I'm the writer of the book Nightingale of the North. This book here, which is a biography about my mother, she was called Mary Hagan, she was known as Little Mary Hagan, who in 1932 became a very famous child singing star. She ended up making 18 hit records to Decca and Columbia. The music that you've just heard there was one of her records from the BBC. It was one of the very first songs she sang at the very first places she ever sang at professionally, which was the Victoria Palace in London. So I do hope you enjoy the records and the music and enjoy the book. My mother was born in 1920 into a very loving but very poor family. It was the time just prior to the general strike in 1926, so things were very, very bad. There was no employment. It was a time of deprivation and poverty. But nevertheless, Mary had a wonderful family, and they all shared a large tenement block with another 10 families. It was a dilapidated tenement block, like many of the people those days were living in that sort of accommodation. But there were happy families and everybody tried to make the best of it. But of course it was difficult. The men weren't employed. There was no employment for anybody. However, Mary grew up to be a lovely little girl, happy, contented and loved. And by the time she was 8 years old, it was quite clear that she was a very gifted little girl. She had a wonderful singing voice. She'd never had any training except the fact that she loved to sing. And she would sing for anybody, anywhere. So the neighbours and the people in the area that she lived in would often sit outside in the summertime because it was a bad time. I mean, nobody had any money for entertainment. So they would entertain themselves when the weather was good. They'd sit outside in the cobble streets and they would sit there and play harmonicas, sing a song and various things. And of course on these occasions, Mary was always the starter. So she began to really get a name for herself with the singing. And it wasn't too long after that Mary got a job. She was actually bringing some money into the family. And that happened because there was a theatre called the Gaiety Theatre, which wasn't very far away. And it was very, very popular with all the people. It was an escape really for them from the poverty-stricken lives that they all, the hard times that they had. So everybody used to rush down to the Gaiety. And of course my mother and her family used to go too. Now it was there, the manager was called Mr. Teddy Hinge. There were silent movies with a piano player who used to play the background music. But then at half-time, there would always be a sing-along where the words of the song would be put on the screen, the piano player would play along for the audience, and they could either sing solos or sing along together. Well, Mary used to love this part. And so one evening when she was joining in, she hadn't sang on her own before. She'd always sang along with other people because she was only tiny. But the manager was standing close by and he happened to notice what a powerful voice this little girl had. He could hear her. She was standing out from everybody else. So when that song finished, the communal singing, he went over to Mary and he said what a wonderful voice she had, and was there any chance, would she like to sing that particular day? Would she like to do a solo herself then? So she said yes, she would. So they chose a song and she sang a solo while everybody listened. Well, it didn't take very, very long, of course, for the audience to really begin to realise what a lovely voice she had. And when the song finished, there were standing ovations with the audience. And by this time, I don't think they cared about the movie. They just wanted her to sing again. The manager, Mr. Hinge, said that he would have words with her mum and dad, and if it was all right with them and her siblings, she had 5 brothers and sisters, so they didn't get left out of anything, and if everybody agreed, she could come twice a week and sing at the Gaiety in half-time, and she would be paid a shilling a time. So that was twice a week, so that was 2 bob. That was a lot of money in those days. So she said, fine. So that was all arranged. He did go to see her parents, and they agreed, Paddy and Sarah, that she could sing. So for the next 2 years, I think it was, that's what she did. She sang, and of course, she became very well known in the community, even more so than the neighbours that they had. These were people that were coming from all over. So that was it. So that was Mary's first entrance into professional singing, I would guess. Now, it wasn't very, very long after that. People said to me, well, how did she become discovered? How was she discovered? And it was remarkable. But it all went back to her father, my granddad, Patrick Hagan, who was a character, wonderful man, charismatic, intelligent man, lovely chap. But he had been in the Royal Navy in the First World War, and he'd served on the Invincible. And whilst he was there, before he went into the Navy, he was a pugilist, a boxer, he was an athlete, a sportsman. And when he went into the Navy, of course, serving in the war, he met a man called Ted Broadribs. Now, Ted Broadribs was a Londoner, and he was a very wealthy man in Civvy Street. He had a marvellous job. He was a theatrical agent, and he was also a boxing promoter. But him and Paddy became great, great friends, because of course he was a boxing promoter, so my granddad was a boxer, so they had a lot in common. And my grandfather became the featherweight boxing champion of the Royal Navy. So himself and Ted were really thrown together for a long, long time, became very close. And then of course the war ended, and Paddy went back to Newcastle on Tyne, back to the deprivation and the poverty. Nothing had changed. And Ted went back to the south. He was wealthy, well off, went back to his business, so he had no problems. But they parted, didn't see each other anymore. Now in the meantime, Paddy tried to get work. He had 6 children by this time, and there was just no employment anywhere. But he managed to get a job parking cars. Now this wasn't really the sort of job he wanted. For a man of his calibre, he was intelligent, he was a very, very dignified man. But hard lines, that was all there was. And sick kids, he couldn't refuse, he had to take it. So it was parking cars in St James's Hall, which was the boxing stadium. So one winter's evening, when he was parking cars, and it was snowing, cold, he had his old overcoat on, his old muffler around his neck, trying to keep warm, and he was guiding the cars in. He happened to see the car, the next car coming in was a big chauffeur-driven limousine. And as the car drew in and he guided it in, to his horror, as the passenger got out the car at the back, it was his friend, Teddy Broadribs. Well, he was devastated. He was humiliated, he was embarrassed for his friend to see him in this state of poverty and shabby, humiliated with this stupid, silly job for a man of his means. So anyway, but he couldn't do anything about it. And as soon as Ted saw him, Ted was wearing his Crombie coat, his top hat, silk scarf, his cane, and he was there to promote a boxer. And his boxer was a man called Ned Tarleton, who was a very, very famous boxer at the time, and that's why he was in Newcastle. So he came running over to my granddad, shook his hand and said how marvellous it was to see you, Paddy, how are you doing? Well, it didn't take long for Ted to realise he wasn't doing so good. But my granddad made light of it, and he just said, well, things are bad for everybody at the time, but it'll pass. I'm okay, I'll manage it. And of course he said, is there anything I can do for you, Paddy? Anything at all? So my granddad, proud man, no, he said, I'll be okay, fine. And he said goodbye. But just as he was walking away, my granddad remembered that Ted was a theatrical agent. So he called him back. He shouted him back. And as he came back, he said to him, just wondering, Ted, he said, oh, you're still involved with the theatrical agency? And Ted said, yes, I am. He said, well, maybe you can help me. He said, I have a little girl, little lassie, Mary. He said, she's 12 years old. He said, and she can sing. Is there any chance that while you're here, because he was there for 2 nights, would you listen to her? So Ted said, yeah, of course I will. Well, I mean, Ted wasn't interested really. He wasn't interested at all in this little girl, but nevertheless, he was his friend. And he said, yeah, he said, I'll tell you what to do. Bring her over to the boxing ring tomorrow night. He said, and we'll put her in the ring. He said, and she can sing to the audience. He could have a nice sing-along. So my granddad said, okay. So he went home and he told Sarah, my grandmother, and the brothers and sisters, and everybody was excited to think that Mary was going to sing for a real agent, man from London, somebody who was a theatrical agent. But of course, Paddy wasn't too happy about it. I mean, this wasn't the venue for his Bonnie Mary. Bonnie Mary was always the term he used for my mother, Bonnie Mary. And he didn't want his Bonnie Mary singing in this masculine environment, beer, smoke, drinks, loud men. But if that was going to be the chance that she was going to have, well, he was going to take it. In the meantime, Mary couldn't care less. Mary was more interested, I found out later, years after I asked her. She said, I was really interested in seeing you now, seeing what the boxing was like and all the things inside. She couldn't care less. But anyway, she turned up. And everything went well, and she was sat there waiting for her turn to actually sing. And true to his word, Teddy Broadrip, when the time came, in the interval, he announced to the men that we have a little girl here, little Mary Hagan, and she's going to give you all a song. Well, of course, the fellas weren't interested in some kid singing a song, but she was lifted into the ring. My granddad lifted her into the ring, and she stood there with her little dress and her little white socks on that she'd done, and tied her up together, and her bobbed hair. She was a beautiful little girl, big blue eyes, this bobbed hair, tiny, petite, wonderful personality, comedic, funny. So she stood there, and she waited for some silence. There wasn't any, and she waited a bit longer, quietly. She looked around, and nobody was taking any notice of her. So she started to sing. And the song that she sang was Sally, which was a very, very popular song at the time. It was a Gracie Veal song. And she started to sing. And as she started to sing, the noise was all around, finally got softer and softer and softer, as a beautiful voice rang out in this big hall, carried right over the heads of everybody there. And those men were quiet. They were husbands, fathers, sons, brothers, and they all had the same feelings. And Mary touched them. She touched their heart. And by the time she'd finished singing, there was clapping everywhere and shouting and stamping their feet, and of course throwing money into the ring. They threw money, and my mother got a little skirt and a little dress, and she picked it up and put it into a little skirt. And of course at the end, so it was wonderful. So at the end of all that, my grandfather climbed into the ring and congratulated her and said how proud of her he was. And then Ted got into the ring. And of course he was absolutely amazed at the voice of this tiny little girl. And he just knelt down beside her, and he just took a little hand in his, and he said, Mary, you're gonna be a star. Sally. Within the next few days, there was great excitement in Mary's household. You can imagine that Sarah and her brothers and sisters were all so excited that their sister was actually going down to London to audition for all these important people. And she was actually going to Ted Broadrib's Gentlemen's Club, which was in the West End in London. So it all sounded very, very, very important. So anyway, arrangements were made, and it was decided they would travel down by boat. And the boat they were travelling on was called the Bernica. Apparently people travelled by boat those days because it was cheap way to get down to the south. But it so happened that on the day that Mary and Paddy were travelling down to London, that it was the same day as the cup final, 1932 cup final between Newcastle and Arsenal. So there were the footballers and the wives, and of course all the supporters on the quayside, and it was mentioned that it was 40,000 supporters, and amongst those 40,000, I don't think there were that many, but there was quite a lot of Mary's family and her friends, and of course the people in Newcastle who lived her and knew what was happening, and of course the Chronicle were there to cover it, because they always took an interest in little Mary, even though she was just a little girl and she wasn't that important, but they were very excited about it going down, and so they did a little covering in the Chronicle to say that little Mary Hagan was going to London, and everyone was very excited. The Berniker finally left the quayside to the waves and cheers of the crowds, and it was a wonderful, wonderful send-off. My mother often used to refer to this later in life when I used to talk to her about it. She never forgot that wonderful feeling as the boat pulled away, not knowing that this journey, where it was going to actually lead her in her life, change her life completely. But anyway, as the boat pulled out to sea, everybody had to be shown the accommodation, and they were shown down to the third-class quarters that the poor people had allocated to them. It wasn't very good. It was bare and little wooden seats and bunk beds, little bunks to lie on. And everybody was grumbling a little bit because they knew that on the upper deck it was the first class and that would be comfortable, lovely accommodation up there. That's where the footballers and the wives would be. However, good humour prevailed, and the Geordies, as always, once they'd got settled in, they all decided to have a sing-along. A sail-away sing-along, that's what it was. So they all decided to sit and sing, and that's what they did for a couple of hours. And then eventually everybody was feeling a bit tired, so they all decided to settle down. But it was just at that moment, actually, that they heard some sort of commotion at the top of the staircase that led down into their quarters. And they didn't know who it was or what it was, but their attention was drawn to the top of the stairs so they could hear somebody coming down. And as they looked up, they saw this lady suddenly appeared, and she was struggling to get down the stairs. She was a beautiful woman. She was wearing a wonderfully beautiful evening dress with wonderful jewellery. Her hair was pinned up in a lovely diamante clip. She had a fur wrap around her shoulders, beautiful jewellery on. She was obviously a lady of some means. And as she came down the stairs in her high heels, that's why she was struggling down these rickety stairs, as she came into view, she shouted for attention, "Hello, could anybody help me, please?" And when they looked up and asked what she wanted, she just said that she'd been listening. They were having a party upstairs, the footballers, and she wondered whether the lady who had just been singing, because of course Mary had been singing along with these crowds of people when they were all singing together, she said, could the lady that had just been singing join the party upstairs, the footballers' party, because they would love it if she would sing for them. And so everybody looked at each other because the passengers, the third-class passengers, didn't know what she was talking about. So this woman said, "Oh no, I'm sorry," she said, "there hasn't been a lady singing down here." She said, "Just that little lassie over there, little Mary, little girl, she's been singing along with the rest of us." And so the woman said, "Oh, no. She said, "This was a woman's voice. She said that we heard." So the lady said, "No." The woman said, "No." She said, "It was little Mary." So then little Mary's ears perked up and she started to sing a few notes from a song. Of course she knew. And of course, once the lady had heard these notes that were coming, she realised this was the voice that she'd been listening to. So Mary was invited upstairs to join the party, and she spent the rest of the evening there, and she had plenty to eat and drink. She had a lovely evening, and at the end of it all, once again, everybody, the footballers and the wives, had a wonderful time. She entertained them for the rest of the night, and then they threw money into the little area where she was standing. Once again, that always seemed to happen with Mary. It was going to become a habit, and so she picked the money up in a little skirt. And that came in very, very handy for her and her dad once they got to London. Mary's auditions were a great success, and Ted was absolutely over the moon. So Ted Broadway became a manager, and Mary got top billing at all the big theatres in London. Victoria Palace, the Albert Hall. She sang for the Prince of Wales. And within a very, very short time, she was recording for Decca and Columbia. She actually made 18 hit records for Decca and Columbia. And it was quite interesting because during the time that she was there, I mean, she'd obviously lived there then. She lived with Ted Brodribb and his family. And actually she became his ward. He adopted her in order that he could take care of her while she was there. He also made sure that she received training, theatrical training, in every aspect of show business. But in the beginning, when she was recording, when she started to record, one of the interesting things that happened was that one particular week, her record, she got 3 records in the charts, in the hit charts, and Judy Garland, who was an international star, only got 1. And of course the record was Somewhere Over the Rainbow. So it's very interesting to know. But little Mary was only 12, and that's what happened. So you can understand she was doing very, very well with her music. So she was there, as I said, for 2 years, and during that time she was reasonably happy, but she did miss her parents and her home, a family, and everybody that she knew. She had a passion for Newcastle. She just didn't like it as an ordinary place to live. She thought it was the most wonderful place on earth, and that was Newcastle on Tyne. It was her Shangri-La, and it didn't compete at all with London. Although London was affluent and she had money and beautiful clothes and big cars, and she lived in a beautiful big house with Ted and his wife and his little daughter. And she said, actually it was years later when I mentioned this to my mother, and I said to her, why did you, because she obviously decided to go home after 2 years. And when I questioned my mum about that, I said, why did you do that? And she said, because, she said, I just want to be back home with my mum, my dad, my brothers, my sisters, my friends. And she said, I wanted to appear in Newcastle. And she thought that that's what would happen. So after 2 years, against all the advice that she was given from Ted and her dad, and everybody knew she was making a big mistake, but she was a very feisty little girl and she had made her mind up and she wanted to go back to Newcastle. So that's what she eventually did. And at that time, she was earning £3,000 a year in 1932, and she was only 12 years old. So we can imagine how successful she was. But they were her principles. She had this inner principle that her family was more important than this wonderful life she was leading. And she came home. And remember, she had left a dazzling career behind her. But nevertheless, she was excited, and her family were excited to know that she was coming back home. Her father, my granddad, became a manager. And he was very concerned because he didn't really have a great deal of experience. Well, he had no experience at all, really, with bookings and venues and contracts and all those things. However, he did his best, and they went back to Newcastle. Everybody greeted them. She had a wonderful party when she went home with all the friends and neighbours. And of course, he managed to get some bookings, and that went on for a couple of months. But eventually, because Newcastle was still very poverty-stricken, there was a lot of deprivation there, unemployment, nobody was working. And of course, it wasn't the same as in London. The prestigious, wonderful venues she had there just weren't available in Newcastle on Tyne. And eventually, the bookings began to really dry up. So Paddy decided with Mary's help, and they put quite a few on. But they were very, very expensive. They had to supply their own dancers and singers and comedians and the actual arranging of the different halls they would use, until it was quite obvious within a short space of time that that wasn't going to work. So the work just ran out. And then Mary said to her dad one day, well, look, Dad, why don't we use the money from the royalties of the records? And to her horror, he didn't know what she was talking about. It was her dad, and he was an honest man. He'd never done anything wrong. But she realised that he had never signed a contract. Nobody had mentioned it to him. And so somebody along the way had obviously, whether it was done deliberately, we don't know, but there were no royalties. And she had made 18 hit records for Decca and Columbia. She'd been earning all that money, and her records had sold in the thousands. Well, when Mary found that out, of course, she was absolutely furious. And she was beginning to realise that she'd made a big, big mistake coming back. And so she told her dad that in that case, she said what she was going to do, her plans were she was going to go back down to London and she was going to start a career again. Because she realised that was the only place, that was the place where she was a star. And that was the place she'd continue to be a star. And so the arrangements, she had them all planned in her head what she was going to do. But of course her father went mad. She'd be 15 and a half eventually by the time this was all settled. And he said, well, you're not old enough to go down. He said, you can't go down by yourself. And she said, well, I don't want you to come with me, Dad. And she said, you know, she still loved her dad and she trusted her dad, but she realised that he wasn't capable of doing a career, planning it all. And she realised she had to get back to somebody like Ted Baldwin. It caused a great deal of unpleasantness within the family. And this was very, very unusual because she never rode with her dad and her brothers and sisters was a happy environment. But of course Sarah got very upset because she could see there was trouble between her, between Mary and her father. And so eventually Mary decided that she had to get away for a while. So she was a lovely young woman and she was a sensible young woman. She loved her parents. And so she didn't know how she was going to get away. She wanted to be somewhere where she could sit and work out what she was going to do with her future. They were big Catholics, big Catholic, practicing Catholic family. So she signed herself into the convent in Darlington, voluntarily, for 6 months. It was a place of sanctuary for her, really. It would give her time to think about it and it would give her mum and dad a rest from all this nasty feeling that was going on at that moment. And she was quite happy with that. And her mum and dad just accepted that and everything went very, very quiet. But it was only a very short time. She was only there for a couple of months when she realised she'd made another big mistake because the nuns were treating her as though she was some daft kid that had this idea of singing. They had no conception of what she really had been and how big a star she was. And so she began to get very, very unhappy about it all. One day, when she was under 16, she decided she was going to leave. And she just walked out. And she actually took one of her friends with her. So she got her little things packed together and her and a friend, they went to Darlington Station and they got onto the train and their intention was to go to King's Cross. But my mother didn't have enough money. She only had a very limited amount of money. So she decided to break her journey in Stockton-on-Tees. And Stockton-on-Tees was a young man lived there called Billy Walker. And Billy Walker was about 6 years older than Mary, and she remembered him from when she was only 10 years old, 10 or 12 years old, just before she'd gone on the stage when they used to sing in the local streets of Newcastle and the concerts she used to put on. And Billy was a best friend of Mary's brother, Patrick, her older brother. So she remembered him, and she decided that she would go to Stockton. She had an idea where he lived, and she would see if she could borrow some money. And I could never understand when I heard the story that my mother would do that. But I realised afterwards the reason she did that was because Billy had a sister called Charlotte. And when my mother had come back to Newcastle, Paddy, her brother, had said to her, is there any chance that you can give my mate, Billy, he has a little sister called Charlotte and can't get work, could you give her a job? So my mother had employed her as a wardrobe assistant and as a dresser on the shows that she was putting on in Newcastle. And of course that had helped the family out for quite a long time. So my mother's thinking obviously was that she'd helped him, so maybe Billy Walker would help her now. So she went into Church Road where he lived and she found the road, and as she was going down the road she saw this young man outside of this house fixing his motorbike, and handsome young bloke he was, and she realised as she walked up to him that it was Billy, and he looked up and She said, "Do you know who I am?" And of course she hadn't seen her for a long time. And she said, "I'm Mary Hagan." And anyway, he invited her in when she explained what had happened. And his mother had given them something to eat, and Billy had said, "Well, what's going on?" And she told him what they were doing. They were going to King's Cross, and they get off the train there, and then she was going to see who she could find to help her with a career. She was going to go back on the stage again. And he was absolutely flabbergasted, and he said, "Well, you can't do that." He said, "What about the convent?" So she said, "Oh, we just walked out." He said, "Listen, I think you're making a big mistake." He said, "I think you better get back to the convent." He said, I'll take you back and just say it was a prank. That's all it was, a bit of fun." And they said, "No way, there's no way I'm doing that. I'm going to London, I'm going to further my career. You know, I've already had words with my dad." She was absolutely insistent. He took them to the train station, and he waited until they got on. He lent her some money that she assured him he would get back as soon as she made some money, and off they went. And of course Billy came straight out of the station, and he went straight into the police station in Church Road, not far from where he lived. And he got into there, and he just said, he reported the fact that these two young girls, he told them what had happened, and they were on the train, they were getting off in King's Cross, and he was very concerned. There were two young, innocent young girls, and he said he was really frightened what would happen to them. So he felt that he had to actually inform the police. So the police said yes, he was absolutely right. They would make sure that they would see to it, and as soon as they got to King's Cross. So of course that was it. So in the meantime, Mary and Alice Pringle, I remember, they were sat on the train giggling and laughing and excited about going to London. And as the train pulled into King's Cross station and they got off, there were two policemen waiting for them. And they were put straight back on the train and sent back. And straight back to the convent. Mary, being the slightly older of the two, and being the one that had planned it all, they said that as far as they were concerned, she had no right to leave the convent, and that she was in the hands of the education committee. And it turned out, they said, when my mother argued and said, "Listen, I'm not here, you know, I can leave whenever I want to. I signed myself in voluntarily. This was a sanctuary for me. I can go whenever I want to go." They said, "No way." What she had signed, she realised, was called the guardianship of the education committee. The form she had signed made her, she was going to be there till she was 18. And she just couldn't believe it. And they said the fact that she'd left, they called she'd absconded, and that the punishment would be that she would be sent to an approved school in Bristol until she was 18, because they felt that she was out of control and she was a bad influence on the convent itself, and all this rubbish about singing. So my mother went back to a little room. She was put into like solitary confinement. She wasn't locked up, but she was ignored by most of the others. She was an intelligent young woman, and she realised she was in trouble. So what she did was, over the next couple of days, the actual fact that she was in solitary confinement worked very well to her benefit, because she slipped out one morning very early on the train again, and she went back to Newcastle. And in Newcastle was a solicitor there who used to act for Mary when she was on the stage. He did all the contracts and all the show business work, and he was called Mr. Frank Lambert. So she got into his office, she saw Mr. Lambert, she explained what had happened and how she had been misled into signing this form and what the actual repercussions could be. And so at the end of it all, Mr. Lambert said, "Yes, you've got a case, Mary." But he said, "I suggest you get back as quickly as you can and get back into their convent without being seen and just sit quietly till I get back to you." So that's what she did. A couple of days later, she was called in to the Mother Superior's office. And as she walked in, the Mother Superior said to her, "I'm rather shocked here. I can't believe this is absolutely true. But we have a letter here from a solicitor, Mr. Frank Lambert, who is telling us that Mary Hagan is taking us to court on the fact that she's in this convent against her will."
that can't possibly be true. So my mother said, that's absolutely true, yes. I'm taking it to court. And so she said, anything else? My mother said. And she just hunched her shoulders, and my mother walked out. Now from then on, Mary knew that she was just going to have to sit tight and wait. And of course the convent weren't very pleased with her. And then of course she realised who the person was and why the responsibility they had for putting him in there. And it was Billy Walker. But within a day or so, the Mother Superior came and said to her, this young man that we want you to see, Billy Walker, is actually a friend of yours, and really would like you to see. Now, normally young men weren't encouraged to come to the convent, but this young man, the Mother Superior, was encouraging, because as far as she was concerned, he had acted very, very wisely, keeping away from all the wickedness of show business. And so anyway, she said, he's come to see you. So of course my mother said, no, I don't want to see him. But she said, you have to see him. So when he came in to see my mum, she saw him in private, and he said, he was very sorry, but he said he thought it was the most sensible thing to do. I realised that you were in danger. You couldn't be in London on your own, and I did it for your benefit. But my mother went potty, and she said, no, she said, don't you. Anyway, she chased him. So, but before she chased him, she did tell him, she said, you had no right to do that. And she explained about this form that she'd signed, that she had, prior to that, signed herself in on her own volition. She'd voluntarily signed herself in. She'd never committed a crime. She came from a good family. She was a good living young girl, never done anything wrong in her life. And they were telling her that she had to stay there. So she said, you have really caused me a great deal of trouble. And she said, I'll never ever forgive you. Well, by this time, Billy was absolutely, in a terrible state, thinking what he's done. But anyway, she wouldn't see him, and he left. And from then on, a couple of weeks later, as the court sort of tried to get things going for my mum, he would visit her. My dad came, because it was my father, obviously, we're talking about. And he kept coming back and visiting her and apologising, but she would never see him. But he didn't stop. He would come every week, until eventually he used to sit in the garden outside, in the convent garden. And the old gardener there got friendly with him. And he said to him one day, he said, well, I'll tell you what. He said, why don't you? He said, why don't you write her a letter? Write her some letters. She's obviously not going to forgive you. She's not going to see you. Maybe if you write her a letter and explain. He said, and pass it over the garden wall, the convent wall, and I'll make sure she gets them. The convent won't know anything about it. So that's what he did. And he would pull up on his motorbike out of the earshot of the big convent wall. Actually, that convent's still there now. And he would climb over the wall, or he would give him the letters, until eventually my mother decided that she would forgive him. She began to understand that he'd acted, he was 6 years older than her, and he was obviously seeing things in danger that she wasn't seeing. So she forgave him. And then they started to meet. And they would meet in the garden. He never went to the convent again. Through the big main doors, he would climb over the garden wall, and they would sit in the garden and sit holding hands, and obviously they fell in love. So that was the story there. And eventually the court case came up, and it lasted for a full year, and there were 5 appeals, and each appeal my mother lost, until eventually she stood up. And of course every time there was an appeal, the court was packed, and the media had picked up the story because she was well known, remember, in Newcastle, and it had become a really big story about this young girl. And so eventually she decided that the last appeal, the only difference was that this time she would speak for herself before they made the decision. And it went through the whole thing again, Frank Lambert and the education people on one side, Frank Lambert on the other, standing up and saying it was an absolute disgrace, this lovely young woman with a lovely family. And of course the public gallery was always full of her family and her friends, and people outside that were fans of hers, people from London, the papers had it in all the papers. And she stood up herself, finally. And she just said, I haven't done anything wrong. And she said, I just want to follow my career. She said, and I wasn't aware that what I was signing. Apparently they used to call it something that, there was a certain term that used that she couldn't quite understand. But this term, whatever it was the thing that signified that she was out of control and she was under their care. But eventually, when she spoke for herself, at the end of the hearing, the judge decided that she was free. He said, I'm very, very sorry this happened to you. He said, I understand now, after having spoken to you. He said, this is a disgrace. And she was free. So that was the end of that story. During that time, of course, she was falling in love with Billy. And so she gave up her career again. Because by this time she got engaged, and then she got married. She moved to Stockton-on-Tees, and shortly after that, the Second World War broke out. So my mother's career was completely forgotten. She had 2 daughters, myself and my sister. She lived a very quiet life. My father became a very important person he was a big socialist and he was a big union man, so his career went well. My mother became quite reclusive, really, I think, over all those years. And she never ever got back. She never sang again for years and years and years, for over 30 years. Until eventually, very strangely, something happened, like the beginning of her life, unexpected, remarkable that the little girl did what she did from an area that she lived in poverty. At the end of her life, something very strange happened again. She was ill, she was in her 50s, she hadn't sung, as I've said, for 30 years, 3 decades. People where she lived didn't know that she'd ever been a singer, never sang at all. Until one day, because Bill Grundy, who was a presenter for the Leeds, in the Leeds BBC radio, played a selection of all Stars records, and my mother's were among them. And after he played them, within that week, he got hundreds of letters from people who said, whatever happened to that little girl? Little Mary Hagan, where did she go? What happened to her? People remembered her. And so, Bill Grundy put out a search on the radio and said if anybody knew where she was. So my mother heard about that and she responded. And she said yes, she would do a live broadcast with BBC Radio Leeds with Bill Grundy. And the result of that was lots of people made inquiries about her again, and she did a television little interview. And the television interview was seen by a man called Dick Irwin. Now, Dick Irwin was the proprietor and manager of the Priory Theatre in Whitley Bay. But he had also been, many years before that, he remembered my mother from when he was a young boy, and he was a fan of my mum's. So when he actually saw her on the screen, he was absolutely amazed, and he loved the fact that he was seeing her again. So he got in touch with the television people and eventually with my mother, and they had a meeting in which he said, what would she consider actually appearing at the Priory Theatre as a comeback? And he said he was offering her top of the bill to appear at the Priory Theatre on a 6-week contract. He thought that it would be like a reunion for the people of Newcastle, for all the people who had followed her all those years before, and the people that remembered her. It would be like a top of the bill, big reunion for the people that loved her and had cared about her. So, incredibly, my mother said yes, she would do that. Now remember, she had not appeared or been anywhere near a stage. She had never sung for over 3 decades. She was now 50 years old. She had just had heart surgery a couple of months prior to that, And for some reason, I think at the time that none of us, I mean, as a daughter, as an older girl, it didn't really sink in. I don't think I took it in, that what she was going to do, or the magnitude of what she was going to do, which she did. And she accepted and she signed the contract. And I think she had a couple of rehearsals. She did a few voice training sessions, I think, for a couple of weeks beforehand. Very, very few, because I mean, you can't teach somebody again to sing after all those years. But the time came and she topped the bill. And the fact was that she was stood in those wings, and she said to me afterwards she couldn't believe that she was standing where she was. And she was, because the auditorium was packed, there were people from television there, it was full of people that admired her, then there was people that didn't know who she was. So she was open to humiliation, to sort of people being sorry for her, and nobody knew how she was going to perform. But I was there, and I can tell you, she was magnificent. She stepped out of those wings, this tiny little figure, with this beautiful silver blonde hair. The manager had decided to turn all the lights in the theatre down to almost darkness, so that when she came in from the wings, and she had a mic in her hand, and she came in singing My Hometown. That was the song that it was about. It wasn't about Newcastle, it was about my hometown. But it was their favourite song. And it was the song, apart from Sally and all the other songs she'd sung, that was the one that the Geordies remembered. And that's the one that they loved. And that is how she walked out of that, like I said, out of the darkness, back into that spotlight with this wonderful voice. And it was amazing because her voice was fantastic. Throughout the whole of the she sang various songs, different songs. She had style. She had a wonderful voice. She took control of the stage. She was still a star, wasn't she? Just as she'd always been a star. Whether she was at home, whether she was on the stage, my mother was a star. And they pulled the place down. And so much so that after that contract was finished, she was offered another contract for another 6 weeks at the Bamborough, which was the old-time music hall in the Cloth Market in Newcastle on Tyne. And she did that for another 6 weeks, until she began to feel tired and not well. I think she'd obviously proved to herself that people still loved her, they remembered her. She hadn't been forgotten, this little girl. The fact that all these people had shown her such absolute loyalty and that they still loved her, at least when she went home, she had this wonderful memory. But when she went home, she wasn't home very long when she became ill. And it wasn't too long after that she died with pancreatic cancer. But she had wonderful memories, and she achieved something that very, very few people would achieve. To find out, after 35 years, that people still remembered and that her voice was still echoing round those streets of Newcastle on Tyne, the Nightingale of the North. My mission really is to get that story on the screen, because it is an absolutely incredible fairy tale, and yet it's all true. The characters in it, I mean, I've missed a lot of it out, just giving you the synopsis of it really, maybe the guts of the story I've given you, but in actual fact I'm just praying that there will be somebody out there who will have the vision to see that this would make a lovely film. And the actors and actresses, these parts, these characters in this book, in my mother's life, were all real people. The locations are still there, the theatres are still there, the people that my mother knew are still there in the records of show business. Gracie Fields, Arthur Askey, Jimmy James, the Crazy Gang, all those famous people were all people that my mother was great friends with. And so I'm just hoping and praying that somebody, I mean, my mother's dream came true. Maybe my dream will come true. And we see little Mary Hagan, a Nightingale of the North, and that's great.